Hi, Art Nerds! Today we're going to do a watercolor tutorial on Canson Plein Air watercolor artboard. This is heavier artboard that has Canson Montval watercolor paper laminated to the front. So we're going to begin with our printed non-photo blue lines that I printed using my Canon printer. And I have a tutorial that you guys can watch here if you're interested in learning how this works. You guys might see some faint black schmutz on my blue lines. That is a printer error. That is not something that you should necessarily experience with your printer. I need to clean my print heads. So the first thing I do is I go ahead and tighten up this illustration. This is from Inktober 2018's Lilliputian Living, where I did families, types of Lilliputians, pets, and seasons. So we have a really cute little girl hanging out with her mousy friend. It'll be a little bit like magic because you guys will get to see how this illustration develops. Now, I love printing water-soluble non-photo blue lines onto my paper. It saves me the trouble of having to come up with an illustration on the spot on the paper. I can utilize illustrations I've done in the past that I happen to really like, as is the instance with this one, or I can do my sketching digitally, and that allows me to make a lot of corrections and to resize things. So this is a great technique if you're an illustrator or you're a comic artist or you're someone who just gets frustrated with the pressure of drawing directly onto your paper. So I'm going to finish penciling this up in time lapse and then we'll get back to you. So once our illustration is entirely penciled, we can begin inking. And for today's tutorial, I'm going to be using a caged G-nib. I'm going to be using FW acrylic ink in Payne's Gray, and I'm going to be using Dinky Dips, which I will show you guys in a minute. So while I'm finishing this up, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about Canson watercolor artboard. This particular piece of artboard was sent to me by Strathmore as part of a care package to help me prep for hands-on creativity. So I want to send a big thank you to Canson and to Strathmore for sending me this. I really appreciate it. When I receive products like this from companies to review or to utilize here on the channel or to help me prep as a teacher, that saves me a significant amount of money. So you guys can see the supplies I have here. There's the FW acrylic ink. It's going to be waterproof. There's the caged G-nib, and I'm also using Dinky Dips, which are small inking cups intended for calligraphers. You can get those at Paper and Ink Arts in Nashville or through their website. So I am inking with a dip pen, and I have a full tutorial for this piece on how I inked this piece with a dip pen here on this channel, and I'll link it down in the description below, as well as in the cards if you guys are looking for a dip pen tutorial. So I mentioned a little earlier that I wanted to talk about Canson watercolor artboard, the Plein Air watercolor artboard. This is a cold press watercolor paper. It's Canson Montval laminated to some of their artboard. And I use Canson Montval for my Cara pages all the time. It's a cellulose based watercolor paper. So that means it's made from wood pulp. This paper is suitable for watercolor, acrylic, gouache, and ink, and it's recommended for wet media. It's an artboard laminated to Canson Montval, as I mentioned earlier, and glued on one side. That's the side that adheres to the artboard. There are 10 boards in the pad, and I'm using the 9x12 size, but it's also available in 8x10 and 12x16, and you guys may have seen me use the 8x10 in some of my prior videos. It is acid-free paper, which is going to make it a little bit more archival. And this particular product is only sold in North America. And you can find a link to the Canson website for this particular product down in the description below, as well as an abbreviated transcript of this video. So I found that this paper took dip pins well. There was no catching or snagging, and the FW acrylic ink dried quickly with no spidering or feathering. So I mentioned a little earlier that I used a caged G nib for this. Now I have loads of videos where I talk about different types of nibs, what kind of nibs might be right for you, and I do nib reviews. This is a Nico G-nib. G-nib is a type of Japanese nib used for inking manga, and G-nibs are pretty commonly used for inking shonen manga because of how much flex they have. They can deliver really thin lines, they can deliver really thick lines, and the reason I'm using a caged nib is someone soldered a little bitty spring onto this nib, which greatly increases its ink capacity, which means when I want to lay down really thick lines, it has the ink capacity to deliver. There's going to be no railroading, and that's when the two times split and you get two lines instead. So caged G-nibs are a really great option if you enjoy using dip pins, but maybe you're frustrated with having to constantly dip, or you're frustrated by your inability to draw really, really thick lines in one go. So I found the surface of this paper to be adequate for dip pin inking. It wasn't too rough. That's one of the reasons you might want to use a cellulose watercolor paper, is the fibers are a little bit more compressed. It's manufactured differently. It tends to be machine made. So it could be better for dip pins because they're less likely to catch and snag on the fibers. Now, the laminated paper, laminated to a sturdier piece of board, means we're not going to have to stretch this illustration, and we're not going to have to adhere it to something else for support. So once I finish inking this, I'm going to allow this to dry, to cure for 24 hours. That allows all of the plasticizers in the acrylic to fully dry, to fully harden. If we were using pigment inks, that allows the pigments to bond with the paper. And then I'm going to erase my blue lines. All right, so we have our watercolor supplies all set up. I'm using the Core Mini palette for today's demonstration. I really love the colors in this palette and I love the pigment delivery. So something that you guys should take note of, even with papers like this where you don't need to stretch it, is I'm applying a wash of clean water and mopping it up and using a paper towel to mop it up, and that removed the blue lines. So when I print my non-photo blue lines, I use a water-based dye ink rather than a toner ink, because the water-based dye ink is water reactive and it will come back up and I can remove it, so you don't even have to see it. So now I'm applying a all-over wash of a cool yellow. That's to kind of help tone this. And while that's still wet, I'm applying cool blue, a phthalo blue, into the background just to start creating the shadows and to give the impression of grass. And you guys might notice that our Canson artboard has bowed a little bit. That is something that is a little bit problematic with this artboard. If you apply a lot of water to this artboard, it is going to bow. It's not going to cockle, but bowing definitely changes how one handles the paper. So while it was still wet, I flicked some additional yellow and blue into it, and now it's had a chance to dry, and I'm going to fill in the violet leaves with a wash of phthalo blue. So you guys can see kind of a cockled, speckled effect that came from working wet into wet and then flicking additional blue and yellow into the background. I wanted it to have a looser, more mottled effect. So in addition to filling in the leaves, I'm also adding some phthalo blue to the clover flowers, and I'm also going to add some of the cooler yellow to the background grass. And as you can see, the glazes of blue over yellow, yellow over blue start to create in your mind the impression of green without losing any of the freshness of those layered and looser colors. So that's one of the reasons why I did that kind of wet into wet technique in the beginning, and I also flicked in some extra watercolor. I find that a lot of my watercolor illustrations end up looking too tight, too rendered, too controlled. So sometimes for fun little things like this, I try to get really loose and lively just to kind of break out of my mold. So I added another layer of phthalo blue to the violet leaves, and now I'm adding in some phthalo to the clover blossoms as well. And I know it seems like a lot. I'm going to use a paper towel to absorb some of the excess in a moment. I'm also using a stronger mix of the phthalo blue, painting in our clover leaves, our shamrocks in the foreground, leaving the centers unpainted. If you guys ever look at reference photos of clover, like just regular yard clover, you'll notice that there's different variations, and there's some that have lighter areas in the leaves than others, and it kind of varies based on the type. So this is inspired by the type that I grew up with, as well as the kind that I was referencing for this illustration. So one of the reasons I really love the Core Mini palette is how beautiful and saturated the colors are in this palette. And you guys can see that hopefully as I use a dioxazine violet to paint my violets. And I'm applying a really saturated layer and then blending it out with a little bit of water. And while it's still wet, I'm dropping in an even more saturated bit of violet so that it will disperse out. So now I'm using a very light mix of alizarin crimson to paint the mouse's nose, ears, and little mouse paws. So for this image, I'm working pretty heavily from reference so that I paint the mouse accurately, I paint the flowers accurately, etc. I know every now and then the whole reference discourse pops up, so every chance I get, I want to remind you guys that working from reference is legit, and that's how you paint things or draw things accurately. So speaking of, now I'm adding a wash of umber to the mouse's fur with a little bit of burnt sienna on top of it, and I'm allowing it to kind of do wet into wet blending. I'm adding a little bit more umber now, since if you look at mice, wild mice, you'll see that they have kind of mottled fur. And I'm painting a warmer yellow for the little grass flowers in the background. I also added more teeny tiny little clover leaves in the foreground just to kind of help break up the image and extend it a little further. So when I paint darker skinned people, kind of depending on the person, I will often start with an all over wash of a really good brown skin tone, and I apply this to the hair as well so that we're starting from a mid-tone, we're not just starting from the white of the paper. It's easier to build up those darker colors. I also added a little bit of very light phthalo blue to the whites of her eyes to create a cast shadow. Once her skin tone dried, I applied another layer of the same, and it's just a mix of a little bit of red, some of the burnt sienna, and some of the burnt umber. So for the grass, I'm applying a much thicker mix of the I want to say the cool yellow, but as I'm looking at it, it's kind of looking like I'm using sap green, but I'm pretty sure I didn't use any sap green for this illustration. So it must be the cooler yellow in the Core palette. And I want you guys to keep in mind that that cooler yellow is just a smidge opaque. It's semi-transparent rather than fully transparent, which can be useful when you're layering it over blues because it makes it more visible. It doesn't just disappear into the blue. And now I'm applying that same yellow to our violet leaves, as well as to our shamrocks. And you guys can see how a layer of yellow, a glaze of yellow, really lightens up the color intensity, and it really makes it seem more green. And that's optical blending. Your eyes are blending the yellow and blue together to create green. So that's kind of a more dynamic way to paint greens in your watercolor illustrations. And as you guys can see, it really didn't take that many layers to be able to develop color depth. So at this point, I believe I did switch over to sap green. Sorry about that. Bo has opinions. I'm looking at the original right now, and it does indeed appear to be sap green. So I apologize if I caused any confusion there. And I think I did that because the shamrocks and the grass were too similar in color, and I wanted to introduce a different kind of green to adjust the color depth. So I find that this artboard, other than some of the buckling, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, and it's not really buckling so much as warping, I found that it handles a lot like regular Montval. I totally saturated it to remove the blue lines in the beginning, and it didn't kip or buckle at that point, and it dried really quickly. I do find, though, if you apply a lot of water, it will start to bend upward eventually. So if you're applying wash after wash, your Canson artboard is going to start to warp a little bit. And I would recommend waiting until it's dry to bend it back into place. So it can also cause the paint to run off the sides, and it can make it more difficult to actually paint because you get this rocking effect. So that can be a little bit frustrating. So I'm adding another layer of phthalo blue to our violet leaves, just trying to create depth, to create some push and pull in this illustration. And because this paper is cellulose, the colors do dry a little bit duller than they would on a cotton rag paper. I would love to see Canson release an artboard that has a cotton rag paper on the front. So at this point, I'm adding a little bit of blush to her cheeks, just a little bit of magenta, and I'm also applying the first layer to her hair. So this was a mix of burnt umber and Payne's gray just to get that darker color. The core mini palette doesn't include any blacks, so you're going to need to mix your own. It does include a Payne's gray, which I personally find more usable than just a straight black. And I'm applying more of the phthalo blue in the background to create shadows. And as this artboard dries, it does flatten out somewhat, but you may want to bend it back into place. So, as I mentioned earlier, I feel like it does handle like regular Montval in terms of technique and dry time. I've painted hundreds of 7-inch Cara pages on Montval. It's kind of my go-to for comic page watercolor. So I'm very used to this paper and I'm used to handling it. So I applied a little bit of the dioxine purple to her shirt just to kind of match with the rest of the illustration. A little bit of camouflage, plus purple is a really cute color on kiddos. So I found that after some painting, it does begin to irregularly warp. So that's something you're going to want to be aware of. And the warp makes it harder to paint on a hard surface like my tabletop because it wants to wobble. If I was doing field painting, if I was painting this out at like cheek wood, that might not be so much of an issue. But that's really kind of a field test sort of thing. So now I'm applying a darker, more saturated mix of the dark brown skin tone to her skin. We're building up color. And this seems a little bit more desaturated on camera than it is in real life. It's actually a pretty colorful, saturated piece. And I'm using a warmer yellow, the same yellow, I think it's like transparent yellow, as I used on the flowers in the background. I'm trying to keep my color palette fairly simple and consistent for this piece. So now that the mouse has had a chance to dry, I'm going in with a really thick saturated mix of burnt umber and Payne's gray, and I'm using a really small brush with light feathery strokes to paint the fur on the mouse. And I have other videos like my bunny, the bunny breeder and the messenger, where I talk more about how to paint animal fur. So I will link those in the description as well as in the cards, and I hope you guys will enjoy those. So now I'm just kind of painting the shadows on her skin. And for this illustration, so normally I would use red violets and violets to paint skin shadows, but since she's laying in the grass, there'd be like a lot of cool shadows, and I didn't necessarily want to desaturate her skin. I didn't want her to necessarily be hidden in the grass. So I opted to keep the shadows very simple, and they're just a more saturated version of her skin tone. I'm also delineating the grass a bit better with a more saturated mix of the sap green. So at this point, I'm just kind of nitpicking, adding additional details, tightening up shadows, using more saturated mixes of various colors. And I apologize for the shift in lighting here. I do not know what is up with that. I'm also blending in a little bit more of the Payne's Gray solution into the mouse's fur just to add some shadow to the mouse's little cheek. Now we're back to normal lighting. Camera, what gives? And again, a more saturated mix of burnt umber and Payne's Gray for her hair, leaving some highlights in her hair to show that the sun is hitting it. And adding additional fur brush strokes to the mouse's fur. So you guys can see how the color, as it dries, it kind of becomes less intense and desaturated. That's pretty normal for watercolors, regardless of the paper and kind of regardless of the brand you're using. If you're doing very light washes, they'll always dry a little bit lighter, maybe a little bit duller than they were when they were wet. So I'm used to having to build up color. On cellulose papers, this is definitely more noticeable. Colors just in general are going to dry a little bit more desaturated, which is why I prefer to use like the Da Vinci palette and the Core Mini palette for these sort of things, because you're getting a lot of color out of those paints. So in the foreground, I didn't like how distinct and tight and rendered the little shamrocks were. So I added a little bit of water, which encourages them to kind of bleed out a little bit, and it kind of extends the shadow into the foreground of the picture plane. So at this point, I'm using some white gouache to add details, and I'm using M. Graham's titanium white for this, but you can use the white gouache of your preference, or you can use Dr. P.H. Martin's bleed proof white. And I love kind of over painting things so that I can go back and add white highlights and make them pop a little bit more. You could also do this with watercolor pencils. And as you guys may notice, the FW acrylic ink, it did not bleed, it did not smudge, it did not smear, and that's because it is an acrylic ink. It is going to be entirely waterproof once it's dry. But I want you guys to note that if you were to apply alcohol markers on top of your acrylic ink, that would actually reactivate, the alcohol would reactivate the plasticizers in the acrylic ink, and that would cause smearing. So acrylic ink and watercolor, A-OK. Alcohol markers and acrylic ink, you're going to want to apply your alcohol markers first and then ink after. And I have videos on that as well. So that about finishes it for this Canson watercolor artboard field test. As you can see, we do have some rocking, we do have some warping. You can bend it back into shape, but while it's wet and while you're painting it, that rocking can become very frustrating to compensate for. This was painted with the Core Mini palette, so all colors save for white were mixed with that palette. And I inked this with FW acrylic ink in Payne's Gray. I went for something kind of cool neutral since we were painting grass. I thought a cool neutral would work well with it. So you can see here some of the extreme bending. I have since bent it back into place so that's a little bit more flat. So I have loads of other watercolor tutorials here on this channel, many of which are more step-by-step and in-depth. If you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know down in the comments below or reach out to me via email. If you enjoy what I do and you'd like to help me continue to do it, you can join me on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. For just $2 a month, you'll gain early access to videos like this one, as well as many others, and you'll also gain access to my Making Comics class materials. Thank you guys so much for watching. Have a wonderful day.